Rows of pale headstones stretch across Gaza City, marking men who died far from home. Canadians, Australians, British. For over a century, they were meant to rest in peace, until 2026, when the ground itself was bulldozed and the silence of this cemetery was shattered. Before we dig in, I need to be clear about what this story is and what it is not. The suffering of civilians and families currently living in the Gaza conflict zone is immediate, profound, and ongoing. That human suffering cannot compare to the historical subject we're discussing today. They are separate realities. And this episode is not about taking political position on the current war. It's about a cemetery and the fate of the Canadian dead who are buried there. The Gaza War Cemetery sits in an active war zone. In any modern conflict, damage to buildings, infrastructure, and even cemeteries can occur incidentally. This is one of the grim realities of warfare. But what has disturbed observers is not just that the cemetery lies in a combat zone, it's that the reported scale of earth moving and the apparent disregard for the care of human remains. These were men who died securing and preserving peace. Cemeteries are built on the idea of permanence. That's why this story resonates so deeply. I'm Stephanie Allen, and today we'll be looking at a cemetery far from home. In early 2026, satellite imagery began circulating through major international outlets, including BBC, Reuters, The Guardian, and here in Canada through CBC News. The images that came out of that reporting were stark. Where there had once been a classic Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery with its orderly rows of pale headstones and manicured lawns, there were now broad swaths of churned earth. In some sections, the stones were simply gone. In others, the ground appeared scraped flat, reshaped, or built into earthen berms. The southern portion of the cemetery, including the entire Canadian post-war section, showed, quote, heavy disturbance. One witness described bulldozer activity in the area. An Israeli Defense Force spokesperson confirmed that excavations had been carried on with heavy machinery operating under wartime conditions. Sections of the First World War graves, including a large Australian plot, were razed. The Canadian UN section, reports indicate there is not a trace left. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission has acknowledged the damage to the headstones, walls, and infrastructure, but they note that they can't physically access the site because of the ongoing hostilities. In a statement, they said, "It's unlikely we'll be able to enter Gaza for some time and are not able to protect the sites from further damage." The Israeli Defense Forces confirmed conducting military operations in the area. Their explanation rested on three core claims. The cemetery lay within an active combat zone. Militants had used nearby structures for cover, and the bulldozing was a defensive operational measure. Underground tunnel infrastructure had been located beneath or adjacent to the site. Excavation, they said, reached depths of 30 meters. And then came the interview that lingers. In CBC reporting, a senior Israeli Defense Force officer was questioned about the cemetery. He reiterated that the site was in an active combat zone, and he emphasized military necessity and spoke of operational requirements and the tunnel threats. But when asked whether there were any steps taken to preserve the human remains during the excavation, he did not confirm remains were safeguarded. He did not describe the forensic protocols. He did not outline procedures for marking or protecting burial sites prior to that deep excavation. Instead, he returned to the language of military necessity. And that moment is difficult to ignore. Cemeteries are not empty spaces, and beneath every headstone, there's a person. There has been no public confirmation that remains were exhumed or destroyed, but there's also been no reassurance that they were not. In that absence, that inability or unwillingness to articulate what was done or not done to protect the dead resonates. And when the earth is moved to a depth of 30 meters in a cemetery, the question of human remains is not theoretical. Wars alter priorities. Tactical objectives can override almost everything else. International humanitarian law affords protection to cemeteries and cultural sites, but recognizes that military necessity in an active conflict zone. That tension is not new. For over a century, the Gaza War Cemetery stood as a carefully engineered landscape of permanence, identical stones, precise spacing, equality in death. It was designed to project stability in a volatile world. In that CBC exchange, viewers heard more than just justification for the excavation. They heard silence around the question of care. A silence that in this case amounts to a violation of the principles laid out under international humanitarian law. Cemeteries and graves are protected sites, even in the middle of an armed conflict. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols make that clear. The dead must be treated with respect, the graves should be marked and preserved, and cultural sites like cemeteries should never be attacked. The only exception is military necessity. But even then, all feasible precautions must be taken to avoid disturbing the graves or the human remains. At the Gaza War Cemetery, theoretically, that legal protection exists. Yet, as the CBC interview highlighted, the Israeli Defense Force officer could not confirm whether any measures were taken to safeguard the soldiers buried there, leaving a troubling gap between the law and reality. For the families, these graves were more than stones. They were anchors of grief so far from home. War graves are meant to provide comfort and closure. And the Commonwealth War Graves Commission principle of non-repatriation ensured that those who fell together remained together, buried near where they died. For the 22 Canadians buried at the Gaza War Cemetery, that permanence was part of the promise. Now, many are left with questions. Were the remains disturbed? Can the site be restored? And will the names remain marked somewhere? A grave is a fixed point in geography. It allows mourning to anchor somewhere specific. And when that stability is shaken or fractured, families can feel as though the loss is reopened. Whether peace will come for those families depends on future access, forensic assessment, and the restoration efforts that may follow as soon as conditions allow. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission is responsible for maintaining Commonwealth war graves worldwide. It is a mandate of perpetual care, regardless of politics, borders, or regime changes. In conflict zones, however, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cannot operate without security access. Staff have reportedly been evacuated to Egypt and cannot re-enter Gaza while the hostilities continue. Through Global Affairs and Veterans Affairs, Canada has expressed concern and sought clarification regarding the reported damage. Under international humanitarian law, cemeteries are protected cultural sites, yet military necessity is sometimes invoked in active combat zones, like Gaza. The legal diplomatic dimensions remain ongoing. From those grim realities of war, let's step back in time to understand why this cemetery even exists and why part of it lies just outside of the main grounds. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission was established during the First World War to ensure that the dead of the British Empire would be buried equally, permanently, and with dignity. The Gaza War Cemetery was created after the Sinai and Palestine campaign of 1917-1918. After the war, scattered battlefield burials were consolidated into permanent cemeteries. Today, the cemetery contains just over 3,000 Commonwealth burials. More than 2,900 are from the First World War. Of the more than 3,000 burials, there are 23 Canadians. But one of those is interred in the main war section of the cemetery. He was killed in World War II. But the other 22 are interred in what's known as the post-war section of the cemetery, or the Canadian UN section. Following the 1956 Suez Crisis, Canada played a central role in creating the United Nations Emergency Force, the world's first large-scale peacekeeping mission. Canadian soldiers serving in Egypt, Israel, and Gaza during the late 1950s and 60s were buried in a post-war section associated with the cemetery. This section, often called the Canadian UN plot, was set slightly apart from the original First World War layout. It represented something historically distinct. It was not imperial warfare, but it was modern peacekeeping. There was a literal wall between the war cemetery and the graves of the peacekeepers. This was deliberate and symbolic. The 22 Canadian peacekeepers did not die in declared war, but in the service of peacekeeping. The Canadian United Nations Emergency Force helped pioneer modern peacekeeping, and now those same peacekeepers rest in ground that's once again become a battlefield. The Gaza War Cemetery was designed as a permanent landscape of memory. Whether restoration is possible remains to be seen. Stones can be replaced, walls rebuilt, landscapes replanted. What is harder to restore is permanence and peace for the dead. Yet the idea persists in records, memory, and the insistence that names carved in stone still matter, even when the stone itself is broken or destroyed. War leaves scars that go far beyond the battlefield. Cemeteries, like the Gaza War Cemetery, remind us of that, of lives lost, of families left behind, and the promise of remembrance. For over a century, these graves have offered permanence and a place to anchor grief far from home. And yet the human cost of conflict is not limited to soldiers long gone. In the present day, civilians, children, and families on both sides of this conflict are living through unimaginable suffering. There are no winners here. The grief is ongoing for the Canadian families tied to a distant cemetery, for the soldiers whose resting place has been disturbed, and for those caught in the crossfire today. These losses are different, yet all connected through grief. Each reminds us that every life has weight, and every death leaves a mark. We honor the dead by remembering them, and we honor the living by acknowledging their suffering. History, memory, and humanity all demand that much. I'm Stephanie Allen, from Dead Canadians Carved in Stone.